your name is well known, Paul. The long-standing work that you've done in Manchester and the wider work in terms of age-friendly cities nationally and internationally. So we are absolutely delighted to be able to speak to you today. This conversation comes as a kind of follow-up to a trip that we did up to Manchester, several of us led by Younghart, to find out more about the work that was going on there. And yeah, we were so impressed. We thought we wanted to share it more widely. So yeah, really appreciate that, Paul. I think we should get started now. So over to you, Paul.
Thank you so much, Ben and colleagues, for inviting me to talk to you. I was going to say this afternoon. Yeah, as Ben said, I work for the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. I've been there in one, I guess, role or another since about 2015-16. Before that, I worked predominantly for Manchester City Council. I wrote my first strategy on ageing or action plan rather, in 1997, I think just before the new Labour government was elected. So that shows you how long I've been hanging around the ageing world. And I was a young man when I started, and now I'm not. So it's interesting one's own personal biography in this work as much as anything else. And I'm going to start sharing some slides now, and hopefully you'll find what I've got to say interesting and engaging. Let's just get going on this. And I think really for me, I'm always keen on the discussion and the debate, because one of the things about the world of ageing is the perception is it's a kind of narrow area of work in many ways, when I think actually the opposite is true. Aging is something that has an almost universal characteristic to it, and it's something that touches every part of our lives in many ways, and all the services and societal discussions and debates around it. So it's something which is endlessly fascinating, and therefore the discussion and debate is always something that I'm interested in, because it's always something that you find out something new every day in our work. So yeah, so these are our lovely allocated colours. I should say, yeah, we have this strap line, doing ageing differently. It's a kind of bit of Manchester or Greater Manchester kind of branding, that Manchester GM does things differently. We were originally allocated the strap line of doing older people differently, which didn't work for me at all on many levels. So we have this doing aging differently. So that's what explains that. And let me see if we can get on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Greater Manchester. For those of you who don't know much about the city region, I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the things that I think have been good in the work that we've done, and the ways that we work. And then I want to talk a little bit as well about the new strategy that we're developing, which is not too dissimilar to the old one, or arguably to the one that I did in 1997. And then just a few reflections, really, because I think one of the features or one of the dangers of doing this work can be that, you know, I'm here on behalf of GM telling you all the great work that we're doing, but actually this is difficult work and challenging work, and work that we're doing in a kind of economic, political and societal environment which is challenging. So just a few reflections on, I think, where we are in the world of aging, and what maybe comes next, and how we maybe orientate ourselves to that. So a little bit about Greater Manchester. This is these are the 10 local authorities in Greater Manchester. This is a map of, it's a little bit old now, 2015, but I think the story remains essentially the same. This is people on out of work benefits and entitlements between 50 and state pension age. And the darker blue colours and the concentrations of that are where those concentrations are highest, where those rates are highest. So what you'll see, the kind of the elongated local authority in the kind of centre to the bottom of this map is the city of Manchester, and the concentrations are in Wythenshawe, which is the kind of social housing, Gordon City social housing post-war development at the bottom where the airport is, Manchester Airport, and then the concentrations in North and East Manchester where those would have been the engineering, mining and other industrial heartland of Greater Manchester 50 years ago maybe, or longer than that. And then you can see those concentrations in the inner city areas as well. So we have close to 3 million people across the 10 local authorities or municipalities. We have an elected mayor, Andy Burnham. I'm sure most of, not all of you will be aware of. He's a high-level, high-profile politician in the UK. We have a series of devolved powers which are set to be accelerated. Our expectation is in the next 2 years and beyond. I think this 64 billion economy is probably out of date now, but the economy, I think, arguably of Greater Manchester is larger, for example, than that of Wales. So it gives you an idea of the scale and scope of the environment that we're working in. The combined authority was established in its current form, I guess, around 2000, where the election of the mayor really, and it's grown significantly during that time. There was an unelected mayor before Andy, but we have a series of directorates which take on a series of policy and functions. So we have an economy, we have a crime team, we have functions around inward investment and housing and planning. We have a public service reform directorate, which we're part of, work and skills, comms, and a central strategy directorate, and probably some others as well. But you get an idea, it's a big outfit now, a big organisation, and plays an important role in policy making in the city region. It's an obligation to do some graphs in a strategy or a presentation on ageing, and this is from the latest census. It's interesting for us. I've just come off a call, reason I was late, because we're trying to produce a kind of state of ageing in Greater Manchester, and these are two of the key slides in that from the census. The first one is the growth from 2011, you can see, to 2041 by local authority in the over 55 population. But I think what catches the eye of local policymakers and senior officials is the growth in the over 75 population for over that 30-year period. And what I think is really interesting, over the next 20 years, something like the over 75 population is going to grow by something, I think, in the order of 100,000 people, or around about 50%. So these are significant changes in the demography of the city region. And if you look at this, look at Wigan and Stockport, the growth there, and two very different areas actually. Stockport, better off area, Wigan a more lower income and middle income area. But we're seeing this fundamental, what I would argue is a fundamental change in the demographic shape of our populations. And I guess my observation at this point is that policy making, commissioning and investment hasn't quite caught up, or isn't, it hasn't caught up really. to the new realities of our ageing populations. So the Greater Manchester Ageing Hub was established formally in February 2016. There's a little bit of prehistory to that, which is that Greater Manchester partners through the Association of Greater Manchester Authorities was successful in a bid to the big lottery for something like a 10 or 11 million pound programme, which was launched in about 2014-15, called Ambition for Ageing, which was a large-scale programme of neighbourhood working in, I think, 25 or so neighbourhoods to create age-friendly communities. So in 2016, as part of that launch, we had an agreement with the Centre for Ageing Better around investment and joint activities. And then, as you can see, across those years, there's been a range of what I think are really interesting and important developments, whether it's policy developments, whether it's affiliation to the WHO, the launch of work around active ageing, local industrial strategy, or work around LGBT elders, our work during COVID, around housing, creative ageing, and most recently our work around cost of living crisis and employment, and as we look forward, agreements and partnerships with a range of other organisations. So this is a broad-based, ambitious programme, and we started with me in 2016. There was me and a graduate trainee, and in 2023 we have a core team of about 11 of us, I think, with funding primarily actually from charitable and philanthropic organisations. We have a lead for each of the 10 local authorities. We also have 2 or 3 research groups which we work most closely within. So the Manchester Urban Ageing Research Group, which you've heard presentations from, I understand, but also the Healthy Ageing Research Group at Manchester University, Manchester School of Architecture, and the University of Salford as well. And one of the features is this kind of connection between research and policy making and practice. So that's where we are. We're kind of, I think, probably the biggest example of this type of work in the UK. And at the core of all of our work, I think this is a little bit out of date now, it's 10 years old, I guess. But at the core of our work, I think, is an approach to ageing which is informed by the WHO age-friendly city model, but also, I think, from critical social gerontology. So this is an attempt for us to try and position where our work is in this kind of citizenship area, as in contrast and also in complementary to other narratives of aging. So on the left is a kind of biomedical, clinical narrative of aging, which is commonplace in policy making and elsewhere, where the focus is on older people as patients, on an individual's clinical interventions. This term frail elderly, a lot of focus on hospitals and health and social care systems. And then a kind of social care, I think, gears around aging, which is set out here. And the dotted red and white line, I think, is there to, first of all, to show my kind of rudimentary abilities in PowerPoint 10 years ago, but also to demonstrate where the vast majority of activity and public sector activity is around this interface. Arguably, that's moved on now, but I think that's still an issue, and I think probably you could add in here a kind of public health gaze on aging and older people as well. But what we've tried to set out is the need for another gaze or another framework for understanding aging, where we see older people as citizens, not just as recipients of care and other services, where people have the rights to the city. We focus on the neighbourhood and city scales. We're interested in social capital and participation, on the age proofing of the universal services, which arguably can exclude, access to older people. We're particularly interested in social inclusion and exclusion. And our ambitions stretch to these issues around changing social structures and attitudes towards ageing. So this kind of underpins our work and has done for many years. I just wanted to move on a little bit about how we work. And again, this kind of analysis of how we work has been built up over a number of reports and just by our experience of working on ageing over many years. And I guess these are some of the features of what we think are important around ageing strategies. So the idea of political and senior support on one level is an obvious thing, but actually it's a really critical thing as well. And it's something that, as you know, somebody who I guess is 80% bureaucrat and 20% sociologist, one needs to understand how bureaucracies work and how you operate in them and how you build leadership around a theme, because local authorities and other organisations generally don't have ageing departments. They have social care departments, housing departments, economic departments, which are generally built up around different professions. Therefore, we have to find a way to stretch across those. But we have to find a way to work in a political environment. The other way that is this idea of building an ecosystem of agencies and organisations and individuals. I think in kind of European literature, quite often it's described as a kind of a quadruple helix. So we've tried to build this through a range of different mechanisms and methods, but also this idea of social movement, where the role of older people as leaders and citizens, and this is really important. Like any piece of work, we're trying to build a story which is understood by citizens and organisations alike, which is about, I guess, in our mind, how the city region, the position of older people now in the city region and its different layers, but also how that's going to develop in the future. And we also need to make ageing relevant. So at the moment, Greater Manchester is undergoing a significant programme of discussions around further devolution. And that will shape really what the city region does over the next decade and beyond. We have to be smart enough to be able to apply our work to that context. You will see again, back to the ecosystem, this bringing together researchers, policymakers, and practitioners alongside the voice of older people is in the DNA of our work, as is identifying inequalities and and focusing on taking action to mitigate or reduce inequalities. And then this last point is that aging in some ways, I guess, is similar to climate change, insofar as it's a challenge and it's a long-term program of activities. And you need to be able to connect the everyday work of our organisations to a longer-term vision. And that's quite tricky, because people can acknowledge, actually, this is a real issue, but connecting that to the work that they do in the next 6 or 12 months or 2 or 3 years is a challenge. I just wanted to throw in some of our attractive looking documents actually as well, which I think are real milestones in some ways, in different ways, and the work that we've done. So the first one is a small booklet. I'm trying to see if I've got one on my bookshelf, which was an alternative age-friendly handbook. We've done this work in Growing Older in Collyhurst, the university has led, on a 14 or 15,000 property development. We've got a work with Nigel Saunders, who's an architect, leads an architectural practice around design for life, and then work around housing. And there's just a few other things here as well, which I think are useful. So one of the things that we did during COVID is work through with an organisation called Talk About My Generation, who have a series of local reporters who are older people, and they work with us on a campaign called Valuable Not Vulnerable, We've also done some work with International Longevity Centre on the economic opportunities of ageing populations. And during COVID, we published several 100,000 booklets called Keeping Well at Home and Keeping Well This Winter. And because we were anxious about the ability of older people to get information in hard copy. So just moving on, we're updating our strategy. We published the first one in 2018. And there's a kind of paradox, I think, in strategy making, which is that there's not always universal interest in new strategies because everybody's got one. And at the same time, if you haven't got a strategy, people why you haven't got one. So we're working on something new. I think one of the things about COVID is that it in some ways recast the issues around older people in a more narrative context, whilst at the same time actually overlooking some of the action and activities that need to be taken across the public sector to address the issues around the impact of COVID, particularly on the poorest communities. But we've gone this time for 4 themes. So work and money, so focusing on cost of living, but also on the need for for older people to be able to work into their 60s. We have significant, as I showed earlier on, significant examples where large numbers of people in their 50s haven't worked and beyond haven't worked for 20 years or more, something like 20% in Manchester about 5 years ago. But we're also doing a lot of work around increasing benefit entitlements and ensuring financial security in retirement, and we have a program of work around digital inclusion. Our Ageing in Place program is really the kind of the local, trying to develop local models, which we've been doing for 20 years actually, but trying to scale them up and improve them. At the moment, we've got which I'm going to talk about in a moment, our Ageing in Place Pathfinder. Aging Well is really an attempt to re-energise and reconnect the NHS, population health and other organisations around issues of active ageing, falls, arguably emerging issues around gender-based violence and menopause, and trying to get this focus on prevention in later life. And then the last area is around, it's a bit of a boring title, but working together, we need to get something that's a bit more exciting. But this is essentially how we grow this model of our ecosystem and partnerships and distributed leadership, and how do we raise the voices of older people, particularly those from marginalised groups, and how we create the conditions for a thriving third sector and social enterprises. So the Ageing in Place Pathfinder, I just wanted to concentrate on this just for a few moments, because it's our flagship, or one of our flagship programs at the moment. And it comes from, as I say, us working really, I would say, for 20 years around how do you create neighbourhoods which are more age friendly or better places to grow older? What are the models that support that? Making the case for why the neighbourhood is important and trying to develop that at scale. So we have £4 million to spend over the next 3 years or so. And this is a partnership with Manchester School of Architecture in 8 Greater Manchester neighbourhoods that have lead organisations, co-producing local action plans with residents, and trying to use this programme to as a lever to work with a broader set of partnerships. This is a map, another map of Greater Manchester. This is actually the darker colours is where you've got, where you've got the higher levels of poverty. So again, in inner city Manchester, but you can see it right across the piece. And in each of these 8 areas, we're developing local partnerships, which are jointly led between older people and local partners, a lot of them housing providers, voluntary sector organisations, local authorities. So that's those are the Pathfinder neighbourhoods. And the model here really is based in partly on the work we've done, I say, in the last 20 years, but also on the naturally occurring retirement community model, which has emerged from North America over the last generation or so as well. And these are the key features: engaging with residents, place-specific, resident-led partnerships, building new relationships, identifying proactive and preventative responses, and using the WHO age-friendly domains to identify and address barriers to wellbeing and participation. I just wanted to end up with some reflections, really, on the work that we've done and on my work, I guess, over the last 20 years. I think we've made some significant progress in our work in raising the visibility of ageing and of the particular models that we've developed in Greater Manchester and beyond. We have a series of national and international partnerships, so with the World Health Organizations, via Eurocities and other mechanisms. We've published a number of international documents as well over the years. But ageing strategies remain difficult to develop and maintain. And I think in the UK context, this is because there's a lack of a national approach. Wales is different. Arguably Scotland and Northern Ireland have their own focus, but there's no clear ownership of our agenda nationally, and hasn't been really since 2011. And that creates barriers, and it begs the question of who leads on the ageing strategies. And if you think about that citizenship slide that I put earlier in the presentation, what can happen is that ageing becomes a narrow concern linked to a particular discipline or department, and that's as its pros and cons. I also think that because there's no national investment or national strategies on ageing, then there is, and therefore accountability by local authorities, you see less activity at a local authority level. On the flip side of that, we set up a UK network of age-friendly cities in 2012, and the Centre for Ageing Better picked that up from us and have invested in it significantly over the last few years. And we have something like between 50 and 60 local authorities signed up to that. But it tends to be at the level of practitioner or kind of middle management level. Ageing strategies, as I said, are long-term by their nature, but political, economic, and policy cycles are shorter. So the demographic pressures in health and social care services continue to remain the priorities. And that creates a difficult environment for us to work in. The last point here, I think, is that the austerity policies from 2010 onwards have meant that public sector organisation resources have been hard to secure for our work. If you think about something like Manchester City Council, I think their budget has been cut by something like 50% over that 10 or more years. And it makes fighting for resources at a strategic level, but also at an implementation and a programmatic level, difficult. And I think my sense is that innovation in services around the kind of broader ageing population will take some time to emerge, I think. And I'm worried that innovation that develops in the private sector will be focused on those who can pay for it. And therefore, there is a risk of that leading to further inequalities in support and care, which you will see in the private sector. So that's, I think, kind of what the story that I wanted to tell, and to share a discussion with you with. So that's where we are, and you can follow us on Twitter, and we've got email and other things here as well. So that's where we are.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Paul. So really good to see that overview, weaving together the kind of historical development, the geographical lay of the land in the city region, and so on. And I think one of the things that struck us when we visited you was your kind of like openness to the challenges involved, and just being very upfront about the struggle that there is to innovate and deliver services. So can I open up the debate? Any questions? If you'd like to raise a hand to speak a question. I think we had a request in the chat for the slides from Simon. We will be putting the recording up online on our website, so that will be available to go back and review. Anyone want to start us off? Simon.
Go on, I'll start us off.
Great.
Probably not a very well formulated thought or question, but Paul, thank you for that. That was inspirational to say the least. No, we are in Bath and North East Somerset at the start of our journey, certainly around age-friendly communities, and learning from our neighbours in Bristol around the Bristol Age and Better programme, which started at the same time, I think, as Manchester's journey. I think what's interesting, and I guess it would seem that your position within the authority, it kind of has added some weight, both political and kind of organisational. We're in the position where we're starting from obviously I'm from Age UK, Bath and North East Somerset, and alongside our voluntary sector infrastructure organisation, we've just pulled together an Ageing Well network, which has been welcomed across the voluntary and community sector. And I guess the question would be, have you got any top tips, hints to bring both our kind of political and local government colleagues along for the ride? I think our NHS colleagues can absolutely see the value, which is interesting. But I think it's with both local government and the NHS really beginning to feel the pinch over the next few years. I guess it's just thoughts, ideas, top tips.
Yeah, I think there's lots to say, I guess, there. I think one of the critical things, and I didn't really talk about it very much, I'm afraid, in the presentation, and it's interesting, we've got a colleague here from the Elders Council in Newcastle, I think. I think the role of older people leading these programs is really important, because they bring a authenticity. However old we are all on this call, we don't really know what the world is like when I think I'm making assumptions, when you're 70. And I say that because when I was 30 or whatever it was, or 31 or 32 and started doing this work, I know a lot more now as somebody who's nearly 60 than I did when I was that old. You have insights, you know more about the world, your life, your family, your body, all these things, your experiences. So I think that leadership issue around older people is so important. In Manchester, we launched, it's 20 years ago, I think, this year, we launched an older people's board. And that was supported from within the local authority, the team that I led inside the local authority. So it was a little bit of a kind of governance, a bit of aging governance inside the local authority. And, I can give countless stories of people who said, oh, we're not that interested in aging, Paul. I said, well, but you need to come to this to tell us what you're doing, to the board of older people. And they go away, with a bit of a flea in their ear. And you'd get the phone call the next day. Oh, look, Paul, yeah, we need to do something about parks and older people, or whatever it was. So I think, and then we have a Greater Manchester Older People's Network, and we have an Older People's Advisory Panel now to the mayor. So I think those things are important. If you look at some of the Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, I think they all have very strong networks of older people's organisations. Arguably in Germany too, and certainly in the USA, where you've got the American Association of Retired People that has 30 odd million members. It's the biggest membership organisation in the world, I think. So I think there's something about giving a platform to groups of older people, and to do that in a structured way which is representative and authentic. And that takes some skill as well, because it's very easy just for the people who are well organised with the loudest voices to get their voices heard, and that's not what we want to do at all. The other point, I guess, here is that there are different models. You know, the model that we took in Manchester about being inside the authority isn't necessarily work everywhere. So, you know, I say you've got the model of the Elders Council in Newcastle, which is supported by a third sector organisation, which is incredibly influential. Salford's quite an interesting one as well. So Salford, you have a partnership of Edge Friendly Salford. Sorry, the Edge Friendly Salford partnership brings together Edge UK and the Salford Infrastructure Organisation and somebody called Inspiring Communities that are really good on community development and older people. And they work jointly with the City Council. So there are different models for doing this. And I think that depends on the appetite inside the local authority, the strength of the voluntary sector organisations and so on. But a model will work, certainly in somewhere as beautiful as Bath, Simon. And yeah, Bristol as well. You've got a good connection with Bristol. Actually, one of the colleagues from Bristol is works as part of our team. Bianca Rossetti is up in Manchester now. So there are different models. I think that I did give 10 top tips. I wrote these down for a bit of fun, actually, for Centre for Ageing Better, and they're on their website now. So they may give you a little bit of help. I don't know. But I generally think people who are smart and committed will make progress, you know. And I think that the message that I've learned is that you have to be tenacious and not give up. I think that's a model.
Thanks, Paul.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I like the stress on the long haul. Jason, have you got a question?
Yeah, I do. That was a great, really inspiring talk with a lot of really sort of big aspirations and ideas. So I really appreciate it. I was thinking as you were speaking about all of the ways in which you know, really the things that older people want are the things that we all want, right? To some extent, right? In terms of health and happiness and community and safety and all of these things, right? Stability. I wondered, I couldn't remember in your talk, maybe I missed it, but the role of sort of intergenerational or sort of a life course approach that you might take. You're sort of emphasizing the importance of older people in leadership and their voices, but how do we sort of bring them into a sort of solidarity with other generations and other ages, and is that an important part of what you do? I'll leave it at that.
Just on the life course thing, I think one of the things, understanding life courses is obviously incredibly important on an individual level, whether that's, you know, the transition from work into retirement, whether that's the things that happen to us earlier in life or relationships. I say that in the context of loneliness. Loneliness is one of those things that gets a lot of attention. I was actually one of the founders of the UK or the British, I can't remember now, campaign to end loneliness. And it didn't make me very popular to decide a number of years later. I think that was a wrong thing to do, because I think it adds to the narrative of older people being kind of helpless or vulnerable in later life, when actually the vast majority aren't. And loneliness, I think, however you measure it, affects a relatively small number of people, of older people, and is also a complex concept. There are different types of loneliness that happen at different times to different people. And to make the kind of leading edge of your work, which many people have done, I think, over the last 10 years, loneliness, I think, is wrong, and we should try and think about, campaigning for positive and good things, and not to, because then if you ask young people, what percentage of your older people do you think are lonely? They'll go 80% or whatever. It's something crazy, and actually the majority aren't. But it's actually inclusion and exclusion, I think, are more interesting concepts to apply and to later life. But the reason I mention loneliness and life course is that loneliness in older age is quite often related to loneliness throughout the life course. And people who are lonely when they're younger and in midlife are more likely to be lonely when they're older. And that's to do with, I think, psychological and other reasons. The intergenerational issue is, again, it's another kind of, it's an interesting one, because I think sometimes it's a moral panic. Every now and again, oh, well, no, older people and younger people don't get on. There's a specific flavour to it at the moment, which is, as the post-war intergenerational contract started to break up because young people can't afford homes, older people stole all the money, etc., etc. We know about that argument, and the other side of that argument is that the most important thing is social class in terms of how well off you are throughout the life course. So these are a fairly complex thing, and there's some evidence that suggests there's a kind of spatial separation of young and old, because more young people go to university than did 50 years ago or 30 years ago. So there's this concentration of younger educated people, inverted commas, in our urban core areas. And so there's some evidence of that. There's also other evidence that children and grandchildren see their grandparents more than they used to. So there's a mixture of evidence. And I guess the question is, what are we worried when we talk about intergenerational work? What are we worried about? I've run intergenerational programs of quite large scale ones, and sometimes you do feel that they are a little bit contrived. We're going to get the young folk and the older folk together to talk about things that are of interest to us. I think a better way to think about these things is about making sure that our work is inclusive and generationally inclusive, and that our local neighbourhood work thinks about intergenerational work. I think there is more to be done around narratives of young and old. But again, all the evidence to me that I've seen suggests that younger people are worried and concerned about older people and that they have a good life, and vice versa. So, it makes good headlines. There are some pretty mischievous think tanks in this space that are making life difficult. And we shouldn't underplay the particular problems that younger people have around buying homes and so on their security. By the same token, we shouldn't ignore that 20% of older people live in poverty in this country. So I think it's something you have to think through, and you have to make it concrete to where you work.
Thank you.
Great. Yes, thanks, Paul. And thanks to Joe for putting the link to the top 10 tips from Paul, which are on the Aging Better website. That's in the chat. Joy, over to you.
Hi there, Paul. I actually wasn't going to comment. I really enjoyed your talk, and I enjoy all these talks, but I am an old person of 77, so I thought you might like to know that your audience doesn't only consist of youngsters. But what I did some research on was I know Jason's work on Japan, but I also work with Indigenous people around the world. And I did that when I still had my mother alive, and my mother was 97 years old when she died. So I used to tell these people I was working with that I had this mother in her 90s, and they'd all go, "How lucky you are, how wonderful to have somebody of that age." And when I came back, because they really reviewed my view of older people, I was much nicer to my mother, because I felt that she was valuable in a way that, I tell you, Indigenous people around the world all value their elders much more than we do, including Japan possibly, but I'm not sure about that. And so I just thought I would share that with you, because the thing that they did in all those places was they respected their elders as having knowledge that they'd begun to lose, because it was often to do with language. So they would know their Indigenous language, and the younger people wouldn't. But it was also to do with the fact that they'd lived a long time, that they knew more. And that's the one thing that I think we lack in this. I mean, I'm in Scotland, and actually in Scotland, people spend a lot more time with their grandparents than they seem to do in England. I worked in Oxford, and I'm still attached to Oxford Brookes as an emeritus professor. But in Scotland, people do spend a lot of time with, and possibly are more respectful of their elders. So I just thought I'd throw that into the discussion.
I think you're right. I'll come back to Scotland in a minute, but on the first point about kind of respecting our elders is it's an interesting discussion, isn't it? Because you can say that you can argue that in quite a few rooms, and you can almost see people, sigh, not that kind of thing again. But and so there is something going on, isn't there, about ageism in this country and in other, you could say, advanced countries, if you want. I don't know if the UK, I don't know enough really.
I don't think I'd go with the unadvanced for those indigenous people, because I was writing about their science, and they have the most amazing science, which we've often gone around the world destroying. We, from the so-called advanced West. But anyway, you carry on. Sorry.
Point taken. But I remember, I completely agree, and I think one of the tasks, if you like, of our organisations, which is why I get concerned about the loneliness. It's actually one of the reasons I get concerned about the kind of loneliness paradigm, is this stereotyping of older people. I mean, there are new stereotypes of older people as well as superhuman and amazing, which is another jumping out of planes and so on, is a kind of another stereotype, I guess. And what we've tried to do in our work over 20 years is produce images of aging that are realistic, but also create a sense of kind of social solidarity as well, I think. And the example that I had that springs to mind is that we had a colleague, I want to say Nigeria, we had a Nigerian colleague who told me that the people in her family or her community would lie about their age, okay, which is something that we're all aware of in Western society. But they would say they were older than they were, because being older gave them more status in their communities. But there is something, the whole Joe Biden thing, there's so much everyday ageism by people on all parts of the political spectrum. I think this is quite interesting as well. This is people on the right, in the centre, and on the left. There's everyday ageism all around, I think, and trying to call this out. I'm part of a group at the Centre for Aging Better that are launching new campaigns around ageism, but it is difficult, and we tried to do some of that. There's one of the things for inspiration that I might offer to you is a campaign called Wrinkles of the City by a French artist called JR. If Joe can put it in the chat, that would be great. And this is where this conceptual artist works with older people in cities throughout the world, and then posts these photographs of older people on the sides of buildings. And for me, we tried to do versions of this in our own kind of Mancunian way over the years. But I think things like that make a bigger difference to how we think about aging than 1,001 reports that come out from our organisations. Scotland, just back to Scotland's interesting. One of the things that I realised, was found out recently, is that social care in Scotland is provided in quite a different way than it is in England. In the ownership of social care and care homes and so on. In the UK, in England rather, I think is something like a quarter of care homes, if not more, are owned by American hedge funds. So that presents an interesting issue. Whereas in Scotland, they tend to be more family owned and so on. So there's something going on. And I guess there's maybe something identity, a Scottish identity, which maybe informs us differently and draws different conclusions than here in England. I'm not sure, but it's an interesting question that you pose.
Thank you. Yeah, I on the Scottish identity front, when I was at Oxford Brookes and I had Scottish students, they always seemed to know more relatives than the English ones. You know, they would know more aunts and uncles and cousins and second cousins, which could add to that that idea. But
Great, thanks, Paul. Young Ha, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. This is not, this is not question, but I just want to share my experience when I visit Korea after we all visited to Manchester. So we learned from, your group, and then there are a couple of very successful age-friendly city in Korea. So I try to explore more about it. That I think in Korea, South Korea, about more than 10 cities and towns are, registered as an age-friendly city. And then apart from one a small village in Seoul, all are rural area. It's very remote and a small town. One of the town, example of one of the town I want to share with you is the town is regenerated with the government grant and the lottery, the money. And then that actually make the whole town is different. So they actually they actually redevelop all the built environment, the hard environment, as well as the soft environment as well. So that time, they actually created an aging hub in the center of town. And then they try to gather and then meet people and then build leadership. And then they try to do something good. And one of the town is called Yeongju. And then they actually create is real employment opportunity for the people because they have their skill. So the towns, the ladies, old ladies actually gather and then they develop their skill for, like jelly tofu kind of things. So they develop and then that it become, because of the grant they supported, they used that grant. And then for 10 years, they actually reached the successful stage to export to Asian market. And then that actually motivate the old men's, group. And then they created some woodwork in the town, and then they train all the peoples, and they loved it. They have a really, really good employment and then social connection kind of things. So that was phenomenal success. But when I visit, is last year, December, then when I visited the two places, I actually didn't manage any appointment, but I managed to meet the leaders in there. But it was quite a little bit sad because when I visit, there is nothing continuous working going on. And then some people just together and then have some social time kind of things. So I engaged with them and then what actually make this decline of this good initiative. And then they said, of course, the finance and then, some grant is very, very important to support all the, activity. But another thing is because the leaders actually pass away and move out of the town, so they lost leadership within the group. And then I asked what would be the best way to, revamping all this activity. And then they said, quite important, not only old people, they need young people in town. They wanted to work together because they can't actually, they have limited capability and they all the knowledge and skill, but there is something else. So they are slowly building to reach middle-aged, young people, even schooled people. So they are trying hard, but I really found this sad to see that kind of situation. So this is just the reflection, what I learned from your side. You have senior, the top group of the governance and then finance and then all different type of people work together. So I wanted to share with you. But I hope as long as they can have that momentum in it and then try to work, probably they will, you know, get out of that kind of quiet period.
Could I just very briefly just come back on? Yeah, I think just two very brief points because I know time's against us. I think there are particular issues in rural communities. I was with Norwegian colleagues a couple of weeks ago, where they have access to health and social care workers is very difficult. China, where lots of people, young people move into the cities for work and employment, leave behind very old villages and type of social support that they need. Parts of the UK is the same. So there are issues, I think, around rural communities and remote communities, which are certainly different. Yeah, I would agree with that. Fascinating.
Yes.
Great, thanks, Paul. We've got we have run out of time, so I think we probably carry on for the rest of the afternoon. But really great to have that overview and link to lots of resources, other resources. So thanks to Joe for putting those in the chat as well. And looking forward to keeping the conversations going between Oxford and Manchester, and good to see representation from other cities around the UK as well. So yeah, once again, thanks very much, Paul. Inspiring, and good luck with your continuing work in Manchester.
Many thanks, and good to see everyone. Take care.
Thank you so much. Thank you.